Right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Microcredit and Financial Literacy Seminar Unveiling the Innovations for Sustainable Poverty Reduction. This seminar is hosted by the Financial Literacy Program of the Autorregulador del Mercado de Valores, Stock Market Self-Regulatory Organization, and we're thrilled to have you all here today, join us for this to have this important discussion. My name is Edison Fonseca. I'll be your host today. And before we dive into this fascinating topic lineup, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you our esteemed speakers who will be sharing their insights and expertise with us today. I will invite you all, our speakers, to open your camera and say hi to the attendees. First, we have we are pleased to welcome Emily Breza as the Frederic E. Abbe Professor of Economics at the Harvard University and co-chair of the finance sector at J-PAL Global. Next, we have Tyler Spencer, who is a policy manager at J-PAL Global, and Michael Hou, senior policy associate at the J-PAL Global. Is here with us also Luis Sánchez-Barrios, professor and researcher of the Universidad del Norte in Colombia, and he will be sharing with us all the comments and questions at the end of the session. Through the seminar, we encourage you actively to participate by sharing your questions and talks. You can do it using the questions and answer box, the Q&A box, or the chat. Our speakers will be happy to address your inquiries during the designated Q&A session at the end of the seminar. So without further, let's begin with this interesting conference. Now I give the floor to Jorge Llano, who is a Vice President of Market Development at the AMV, for some opening remarks. Jorge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Edison. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is an amazing webinar, so I'm very happy to be here. We are gathered here to delve into two crucial topics, I think, for emerging markets such as Colombia: microcredit and financial literacy. As you know, well, it's a privilege to be here in the company of esteemed experts from J-PAL. I extend my gratitude to Emily, Tyler, and Michael for sharing their expertise with our audience here in Colombia. And as you can see, Colombia, I think, is very relevant, those topics. And for example, our economy is mostly based on SMEs, and this is a huge challenge that we have. Also, we have another challenges. For example, our labor and firms informality is very, very high. And more often that we heard a lot of news, sadly, about pyramidal schemes in Colombia. So financial literacy, microcredit are essential to our goals in the financial sector. And nowadays, we should use all the tools developed in the recent years to achieve the goals in our sector. For example, we have access to new technology. Some weeks ago, we had an amazing webinar talking about financial inclusion and how the synergy between private and public sector using these technological advances have increased the access to new financial products to new population. And this is the first step to provide more and better microcredit due to the information that you could gather with this new population in the system. So this is like the first step that you will work on to fulfill these objectives. And also, partners as J-PAL have been teaching us how important it is to use another developments, such as behavioral economics, and how the importance to evaluate different interventions to get and to fulfill the objectives that we set at the beginning of the program. By leveraging these advances, we increase our ability to make meaningful and lasting impact in the society. So it's a real pleasure to be here in this webinar. With that, I express my gratitude once again for your presence. I encourage, as Edison said, to actively engage, inquire, and make the most of this opportunity. Let's talk about these topics. Hopefully, you will learn a lot, and we will learn a lot of these relevant issues in the world. And welcome once again to this enlightening webinar. So let's start with this seminar, please.
Thank you, Jorge. So now Emily, Tyler, and Michael, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my slides here. Can everyone see this fine?
Yep. Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for having us today. My name is Michael Hou. I'm a senior policy associate at J-PAL Global, and I'm joined by my colleagues today, Tyler Spencer, who's the policy manager, and Emily Breza, who is a professor at Harvard and also a co-chair of the finance sector at J-PAL. We're going to be talking today about the sort of evidence that we at J-PAL see around microcredit and financial literacy. And to give you an agenda of our seminar today, I'm going to first kind of introduce J-PAL for those in the audience who might be unfamiliar with our organization and our work. And then from there, we'll dive into the evidence around microcredit. I'll be leading that section, and then I'll hand it off to my colleague Tyler, who will be discussing financial literacy, and then we'll open up for some Q&A. So for those of you who are unaware, J-PAL, the full name is the Abdul Latif Jamil Global Poverty Action Lab. And as the name suggests, we are a poverty reduction research organization. And so at J-PAL, we take a scientific approach to innovate, test, and scale up solutions. And what we mean by scientific approach really means that we focus a lot on randomized evaluations to test interventions that aim to reduce poverty. So our affiliated researchers try to understand the conditions and causes of poverty and to tailor solutions to tackle these problems, which we then evaluate using the rigorous randomized evaluation method, or RCTs as the academics would call them, randomized control trial. And by using the creative potential of our researchers, innovating on social programs and testing them, we aim to help governments, donors, and NGOs be more effective. And to also illustrate what we're focused on, we're strongly focused on connecting the dots from research to action. So we fund new cutting edge research on various topics through our initiatives, which are sort of like competitive research funds to carry out projects by providing research support on the ground as well. From there, we use this evidence to inform policymaking. So we summarize evaluations and we also synthesize them, which is the microcredit policy insight is an example of that synthesis work that we do. And then we also disseminate it, which this presentation / seminar is also an example of. And we also work with partners to build a culture of evidence use. Lastly, we provide online and in-person education programs with a focus on data and evidence use. And so here, I just want to briefly open our doors wide and say that we welcome all opportunities for collaboration with anyone in this call. And I want to flag that we do offer an open application in-person executive education course called Evaluating Social Programs, where we provide training on randomized evaluations, how you can do them yourselves, which you can use to determine whether that methodology is a good fit for your own research and policy purposes. So I can share some of that information with Edison after this call, which he can then share with the rest of you. But we hold these trainings once a year in several of our offices, including right here at MIT and also asynchronously online in Spanish. So I invite all of you to visit our website and to have a look at our evaluations and evidence syntheses and training programs yourselves, and to see which one of those might be a good fit for you, and to also reach out to Tyler or myself or Emily if you ever want any sort of direct evidence sharing sessions, kind of like this one right here. So moving on, we are rather than sort of a research center, we're really truly a global organization, a global network of offices and researchers. And our offices provide us local grounding, which is really critical to the success of our work. So we have 7 regional offices, which you can see on this map, including one in Latin America and the Caribbean. And our teams in these offices, they understand local issues, local contexts, and local languages, and also really form close relationships with partners like governments, advocacy organizations, and NGOs to help sort of map evidence to the priorities of the partner and to build up really a culture of evidence-informed policymaking, which we're really committed to at J-PAL. And this is just to show that our network is not only geographically sort of diverse, but also we have more than 260 affiliated researchers that are based at over 90 leading universities around the world, including the ones that you see here. And then J-PAL's sectors, Tyler and I and Emily are involved in the finance sector, but if any of you are interested in any of these other sectors, you are free to contact us for any work that you might be interested in around something like labor or firms or anything else. Each of these sectors have a team of experts on staff who work with our affiliated researchers to sort of share their research with wider audiences and draw out key policy insights. Okay, with that aside, I'm going to turn to microcredit now, sort of the meat of this presentation. So just to give you an outline of what I'm going to be discussing, I'm going to first talk about our theory of change, and then I'll get into sort of the evidence on the classic microcredit model, which largely was based on a lot of previously existing studies before we decided to update the synthesis product around microcredit, which is based on a lot of variations of the classic model, as well as some revisits to the older studies around the classic microcredit model. And then lastly, I'll just wrap up with some brief policy lessons and recommendations. So this is our theory of change for microcredit. It describes how we think microcredit can lead to better outcomes if it works. And the idea here, as many of you are probably familiar with, is that increased access to credit can lead to greater business investments by micro entrepreneurs who are looking to either start a new business or expand and improve a current one. And if firm owners are able to make those investments in, say, capital and labor, then we might expect some increase in their revenue and hopefully their profits. And if they're taking home more money from their business, they might make more money to spend on consumption, but also make investments in important things like health and education to sustainably lift themselves out of poverty and sort of low income status. In the real world, though, we don't always see things play out this way, and I'll be kind of getting into a little bit of that in this next section here around the evidence on the classic microcredit model. So before we get into the deviations from the theory of change, though, I want to briefly go over, what the classic microcredit model was all about for anyone on the call who might be slightly unfamiliar. So the classic microcredit model is really designed to address a lot of the issues that prevented lending institutions from expanding their services to those who really needed it and who didn't have prior access to it. And some of those challenges included a lack of information, high screening costs, and high risks of borrowing, as well as just high risks of lending on the part of the MFI or the lending institution. So a lot of microfinance institutions and microcredit products sort of shared a lot of the common traits that you see here, including group lending, which basically means that group members are jointly responsible for each other's loan repayments, and they also guarantee those loans, which means that borrowers might feel more pressure to repay their loans so as not to let their peers down. Group lending can also involve peer screening, which helps the financial institution gather some information on its borrowers in a low-cost way. immediate repayment and high repayment frequency as a way to instill fiscal discipline among borrowers and reduce the risk of lending to the financial institution was also common. A lot of these products were meant to be used for business purposes, although granted that hasn't always been the case. And most of them were targeted towards women borrowers. This is just to show you that the 7 sort of seminal randomized evaluations on the impact of the classic microcredit model kind of span different contexts around the world. And many of you may be familiar with these studies. They spanned 4 continents. They covered both rural and urban areas and also looked at across a wide range of borrowers, with the point being here that the classic microcredit model really was being studied across many contexts. And this table here kind of visualizes the impacts on a set of indicators that represent our theory of change as we move down the rows. And so to sort of summarize what's going on here, we see that there was kind of a smattering of positive impacts across the board, but really no country is showing the entire theory of change as we would have hoped. And there's also no clear pattern for any specific outcomes. You may also notice that none of the 7 studies found significant impacts on borrowers' household income on average, which is kind of a crucial step for the rest of that theory of change, where they start to make investments, consume more, etc. And so moving past this, digging deeper, some researchers began to look at how impacts varied actually between different kinds of borrowers, rather than just looking at sort of the average effect. So through meta-analyses and follow-up analyses of some of the older microcredit studies, we see that it's actually really the larger pre-existing or already profitable businesses that were achieving higher profits in those original sort of 7 classic microcredit studies. And this was definitely also the case in Hyderabad, India, where researchers initially found that microcredit was not having a strong impact on key outcomes for the average borrower, with mixed effects on business activity like small business investments and profits. And also, kind of as an aside here, not really any measurable impact on consumption, health, education, or women's empowerment. 6 years later, though, the researchers returned to the study and found that households who are already running a business before the introduction of microcredit actually fared much better after receiving microcredit compared to receiving, experienced households who did not receive microcredit. So in other words, experience matters. And this was a really important finding because it suggested that even though at the surface level, it may have looked like microcredit wasn't really having that average or having a strong and transformative impact for the average borrower, if you sort entrepreneurs into those who might be talented or who have prior experience or who might otherwise have sort of what we would call high potential, if you group those into their own sort of bucket and target those folks with microcredit, you might actually see an increase in the impacts of credit for them and better facilitate increases in income and well-being. And these people might go on to create jobs for others if they run more successful businesses. So kind of teeing up the next section here, researchers also began to interrogate why the impact of microcredit was so limited, such as how borrowers may face other barriers to seeing the impacts of microcredit, or how loan terms may be too strict or rigid for the average borrower. So they began to study several tweaks to the classic microcredit model. And that research serves as the basis for a lot of this next section. And as I mentioned before, also serves as kind of a basis for a lot of the updates that we made to our policy insight around microcredit, which you can check out on our website. So here's some of the topics that we focused on in our review. So how loan products can be modified to account for the unique challenges that women may face in certain contexts. What the impact is of targeting high potential entrepreneurs. So kind of extending that study in Hyderabad a little more. We also look at ways of increasing repayment flexibility or extending the grace period of a loan, those sorts of options to make the terms of a microcredit contract a little less rigid. And yeah, we can go ahead and dive into these now, starting with the impacts on women specifically. So before I get into some of the deeper evidence here, I want to provide some motivation and context for this section. So early on, researchers began to note that capital, and this was not just microcredit, but also cash grants, that capital wasn't having as strong of an impact for women as it was for men. And from some studies that provided a sort of capital infusion to micro entrepreneurs or capital transfer, men were actually making higher returns than women were. But then a reanalysis of 3 studies, including some in the early wave of microcredit, found that the return on investments that men and women borrowers made were actually quite similar. So it wasn't that women were making poorer investment choices or anything like that. Something else was kind of going on here beneath the surface. So to help us understand the scenario, we can think of women and men as having 2 options around what to invest in. So they can either invest in their own enterprise or in another opportunity in their household, say a business that their husband runs or somebody else in the family runs. You could also see a case where the borrower spends this money on consumption spending, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'll stick to these 2 options. When taking a closer look at the data, researchers revealed that capital directed towards women entrepreneurs was often allocated to other household enterprises. And so even if sort of on that surface level, we're seeing no impact of capital on the profits of their own enterprises, we see that the women receiving these finances can actually be increasing earnings of their household with their investment and spending decisions. So to say this a different way, the pattern we're seeing is that in cases where women were in a household where there is also a male enterprise owner, they actually made less than women who owned the sole enterprise in their household. And so we can arrive at sort of the main point of this motivation, which is that women often use their resources, including the proceeds of their loans, to invest in household opportunities besides their own business. And this potentially reflects social pressures that they may uniquely face to share capital with other members of their household. To address the issue of household pressure to share money, one researcher designed an intervention in which money was instead directly deposited into a privately held mobile money account. So it's something that it's digital, only they can access. Nobody in their household may even needs to know that they're receiving money if the borrower doesn't want them to. Meanwhile, a comparison group received cash, and that's sort of similar to what you would see in a typical microcredit setup. And so in the group that received the money digitally, women increased their profits by around 15%, and the value of their business capital by 11%, as well as increases in their household income and consumption. The researchers in this study did some qualitative research among the participants as well, which revealed that a lot of people who benefited the most from the loan also reported that having that mobile money account did indeed alleviate some of the pressure to share the loan with family members and also increased their control over their own loan. So what we're seeing here is some evidence that products that sort of tighten women's control of their capital can enable higher returns to that capital on investments in their own enterprises. And also, an exciting potential use case as the use of digital financial services sort of proliferates around the world, and something that we at J-PAL are really turning an eye towards in the near future. So next is identifying high potential entrepreneurs. As we saw earlier in Hyderabad, India, there may be some borrowers who have some more experience than their peers, and maybe have higher skill sets or other traits to enable them to grow faster, sort of in that high potential bucket of borrowers. And so a meta-analysis of the initial wave of RCTs also found that the impact of microcredit was negligible for households with no business experience, although the impacts on those with prior experience was much larger, though still uncertain. There are some studies around ways to identify these entrepreneurs outside the context of microcredit, but also want to acknowledge upfront that the question of how to target in a manner that doesn't involve, deploying a costly network of information gathering agents is one area within microcredit where more research is needed, because one of the points of microcredit was to make it scalable and low cost to the lender. So some options include some options of identifying these high potential entrepreneurs, including surveying on certain traits, which I'll kind of get into a bit on the next slide, asking local community members who know their peers better than any outsider would know, who in their network they think might make the best use of a loan or run the most successful business. Also, mobile phone data has been used before by researchers in South America before to sort of predict the likelihood of loan repayment and at very little cost. So returning to my point around surveying around certain traits, this was actually what was done in one study in Egypt, which found that risk-taking behaviors and optimism levels could be used to predict future business performance and the ability of a borrower to repay a loan or default. In this project, a local lender provided large loans to borrowers, and the size of the loans in this specific study were much larger than the average microcredit loan. But the findings could help inform MFIs interested in scalable models of borrower identification. With that aside, at baseline, to kind of get into intervention now, at baseline, the researchers administered a survey in which borrowers provided business-related and demographic information. And within this survey, they also took a cognitive test and filled out a questionnaire designed to measure their personality traits, such as optimism and attitudes towards risk. And after that, the researchers used this information to group the borrowers into 4 separate buckets, with the highest ranked bucket being what we're calling sort of the high performers, and then on the low end, the low performers. And it turns out those who were predicted to be high performers, so in that top bucket, did see substantially higher profits and higher household consumption spending relative to the comparison group who did not receive that large loan. On the other hand, though, and this is kind of where it gets interesting, for the low performers, their profits actually halved after receiving this large loan on average. And it turns out that these borrowers who suffered lower business performance were also more likely to score as highly optimistic and also had high levels of risk tolerance based on the personality question from earlier. So you can imagine somebody who is very optimistic and very risk-loving taking on an investment that maybe is not such a good idea and maybe not questioning, sort of self-questioning their investment decisions compared to somebody who takes more careful steps. And this is one of the innovative ways in which researchers have been able to identify high potential entrepreneurs as well as potentially riskier borrowers, though we will need more research certainly to determine more like cost-effective ways to do so, as you could see this method being somewhat challenging to scale for MFIs. Okay, so the next, or sort of the last bucket of innovations that I wanted to cover today is around flexible repayment terms. So after the modest findings of microcredit from the early wave of randomized evaluations, researchers began to wonder whether the inflexibility and rigidity of a lot of microcredit repayment terms was kind of discouraging investments that might be risky but profitable. And a lot of microcredit products asked borrowers to start repaying their loans only a couple weeks after the loan began and with very tight repayment schedules, sometimes like once or twice a week, with the intention around this being to instill a sense of fiscal discipline and responsibility among borrowers. You could imagine, though, a situation where a borrower takes out a loan, but immediately has to repay that loan, and they might be scared as a result to make a big investment that is risky but could pay high returns. So some started to devise potential innovations to address these issues, such as issuing a grace period or reducing the frequency of repayment, allowing people to delay repayment sometimes. And so I'll get into one early study now, which did study the impacts of a microcredit product with a 2-month-long grace period. Or in other words, this is a 2-month period after loan disbursement where borrowers don't have to start repaying yet. And so delaying the repayment period actually led to clients being twice as likely to start a new business. This is a list of randomized evaluations around repayment flexibility that we looked at, which you can also find from that online policy insight around microcredit that we published if you'd like to sort of dive into these studies yourselves. But you can see from this table that generally, greater flexibility or grace periods can lead to better outcomes, including firm profits and household income, sometimes at the expense of default, but often not. Like anything though, as we just saw from the last slide, flexibility is not really a one-size-fits-all solution and can even have some drawbacks for some. And one important point here comes from this recent study in Colombia, which I've circled the results from here, which found that null effects on profit and also increases in default. And I'll talk about this study now as kind of a cautionary tale on flexibility. So this was a study that looked at the impacts of providing the option to pass, is what the researchers called it, or postpone up to 3 monthly repayments. And indeed, some of the studies from the last slide used a similar innovation that allowed borrowers to defer a certain amount of repayments, which could be useful if they were going through tough times, for example, or if their cash flows didn't exactly match the repayment schedule. And the key difference here that I want to highlight is that in this intervention, the lender specifically lent to first-time borrowers or borrowers who did not have experience like fully repaying a loan successfully, whereas the other interventions were lending to borrowers who, for the most part, had already successfully repaid a loan. And in this case, it turns out that there was not only a higher likelihood of default, but also no impact on business performance indicators like revenue and profits. So sort of in a similar vein of the study in Egypt, where we saw some optimistic and risk-taking borrowers struggle to make good use of their loan, this evaluation is telling us that we do need to be kind of careful when designing these flexible products. If flexibility is meant to stimulate higher risk and higher reward investments for some borrowers, but for others, it's increasing risk while not really providing much by the way of benefits to the borrower. And this may also be context specific. So there may be areas where financial literacy is low, and especially so for those without prior experience borrowing and repaying a loan or much experience operating a business. In such cases, it's possible that access to credit coupled with financial literacy training on how to properly plan finances, manage loans, and sort of telling people what the risks of borrowing are can improve outcomes for borrowers. So I'm starting to set up the next section here. It's also possible that, the rigid repayment structures of classic microcredit products themselves may actually kind of be serving their original purpose of teaching fiscal discipline around repayment. This does need to be studied more, but I want to wrap up now with some policy lessons and recommendations around microcredit. So one thing that we really wanted to highlight with this new insight is that whereas previously a lot of the messaging around microcredit was not super optimistic, there was a lot of doubt on whether the impacts of microcredit were actually there or not. We want to say now that donors and policymakers and other sorts of implementing organizations, they should understand the limitations of the classic microcredit model, which are there, but also understands the impact of potential product tweaks as well to make that model more effective. As examples of these innovations and tweaks, so high potential entrepreneurs may see higher returns to microcredit, flexible repayment options that relax stringent repayment requirements can potentially increase investment opportunities and business outcomes, all while, with that caveat that we need to be careful in who we target and also the design of those. And also adjusting the loan, the mode of loan disbursement can increase women's control of capital as well as the returns to their investments that they make. With that, I will hand it over to Tyler now to discuss financial literacy and capability. And Tyler, just let me know when you want me to switch slides.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's a pleasure to be joining you all today. I'll be covering financial literacy, education, and capabilities. Financial literacy and capability are inseparable from most other finance interventions. If you're offering a new product, beneficiaries must learn about it prior to deciding whether or not to accept the offer. But many interventions focus only on financial literacy when evaluating whether various financial learning mechanisms affect financial behavior and other outcomes. In general, financial knowledge levels among individuals in both low-income and high-income countries tends to be very low. Studies have shown that financial literacy directly addresses information and knowledge gaps, may be a factor in avoiding financial risks, and is linked to higher levels of bank account usage, retirement planning, savings, diversified investments, and credit management. So researchers have looked at whether financial education programs can reduce information and knowledge gaps and improve financial behavior. Next slide, please, Michael. So what is financial training and why is it important? There is no single definition of financial literacy, capability, education, or training, but multiple meta-analyses do provide some defining factors. Financial literacy is the equivalent to knowledge that we have, while financial capability focuses on skills, attitudes, and behaviors. That is the ability to take action and not just having knowledge. Financial education is important because it is often viewed by policymakers as the single most effective policy to increase financial access and improve behavior. In a World Bank global poll of country officials and financial sector experts, financial education was the leading response to the question, what is the most effective policy to improve access to finance among low-income borrowers? Now that we've established the importance of financial literacy and the policy relevance of education, let's explore some rigorous evidence on what we know. Next slide, please, Michael. Thank you. Emerging research suggests that certain ways of designing and targeting financial education can promote welfare-enhancing financial behavior among low-income individuals. These solutions include making financial education simple and actionable, personalized for individual needs and situations, timed to coincide with decision-making, convenient to access and entertaining to participate in, and targeted towards those who are primed to learn, such as youth and young adults. Next slide, Michael. Thank you. It is important to note a recurring pattern with many financial interventions is low take-up. Take-up provides a first-order look at the questions of whether financial education is in high demand. As the table above shows, low attendance can be a real challenge. Additionally, it is not clear that providing incentives or offsetting the costs is the solution to increasing demand for those programs, as can be seen with Indonesia, Mexico, and Qatar. Taken as a whole, there are some emerging insights into what makes financial education attractive as well as effective. Let's explore a few studies and examples of how interventions can be effective. Next slide, please. According to a report from Citi Foundation, 3/4 of people around the world with bank accounts have never received any form of financial education or training. Simple, targeted, actionable, and accessible training interventions have demonstrated impacts on outcomes. In Colombia, accessible trainings delivered through tablets improved financial knowledge as well as behavior. In India, researchers tested actionable interventions such as individual counseling, goal setting, and incentives, and they found that financial knowledge did increase across all three interventions, but improvements in financial behavior occurred only through counseling and goal setting. Last, in the Dominican Republic, a simple rule of thumb, tips for financial decision-making, led to improved businesses and practices and outcomes for micro-entrepreneurs. So let's delve a little bit deeper into all of this. Next slide, please, Michael. In Colombia, researchers collaborated with Fundación Capital and the Colombian government to design the Lista initiative for a subset of Más Familias en Acción conditional cash transfer beneficiaries. Through this program, community leaders circulate access to a shared tablet computer and smartphones in 30 municipalities, which enabled participants to spend time with training applications on the device. To overcome literacy issues, the program also incorporated audio, video, and gaming elements, speaking to the accessibility and entertainment aspect of the intervention. Additional SMS reminders were sent out over the course of 4 months. Overall, intervention recipients had a better understanding of savings and budgeting concepts for at least 25 months. Trust in banks increased in the short run, that is 7 months, and they were more likely to have savings goals and saved more. It also reduced 5%. Importantly, these impacts were larger for households that face relatively higher financial challenges, for example, individuals who lived in more rural areas. Informed by these results, Fundación Capital has expanded the Lista initiative to reach approximately 520,000 individuals in Brazil, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Mexico. Next slide, please, Michael. In the Dominican Republic, researchers collaborated with the Savings and Credit Bank to examine how targeted and simple rule-based financial training compared to accounting training impacted small business owners. This rule of thumb training was designed to simplify financial decision-making and included several strategies on how to separate business and personal accounts, estimate business profits by changes in business cash, paying oneself a fixed salary, and easy to implement tools for reconciling accounts when business and personal expenses have been mixed. The accounting intervention taught basic accounting principles such as record keeping, inventory management, calculating profits, and investment management. The courses took place once a week for 3 hours for 5 and 6 weeks, respectively. Next slide. Participants who received the rule of thumb training were more likely to implement financial practice lessons, as you can see in the slide, such as keeping account records, separating personal and business accounts, and calculating revenues formally. Additionally, rule of thumb recipients were also more likely to save and improved business outcomes with average sales increasing, especially during bad weeks. This study demonstrates how entrepreneurs can benefit from being made aware of simple yet sound business practices. Next slide, please. Building on the success of the Dominican Republic intervention, researchers attempted a similar rule of thumb training in India and the Philippines. And similarly, as Michael spoke to earlier, this is a bit of a cautionary tale in that micro entrepreneurs with outstanding loans were targeted to receive voice-based messages via mobile phone at the end of each week for 41 weeks. The idea behind this was a cheaper and easier to scale intervention. But the preliminary results show that there was no significant impact in the program across outcomes. Part of the reason for this lack of impact, though, may be from that listenership was low. Although 83% of participants answered the calls, only 48% listened to the messages. However, more engaged participants who listened to more than half of the total message content did increase their monthly business sales and were less likely to withdraw cash from their business for personal use. These results suggest that voice messages could have an impact on business practices if the messages are heard. Next slide, please. In order to see where the path from education to action breaks down, researchers conducted a randomized evaluation of a video-based financial education course on participants' financial behaviors in India to study which components of the financial education programs are most effective. While the course alone had no impact on participants' abilities to carry out financial calculations, it did influence their awareness and attitudes towards financial products. Overall, financial education alone increased participants' awareness in the details and the benefits of financial products, but only influenced in financial behaviors when paired with personalized supplements such as goal setting and counseling. Results suggest that traditional financial education programs may not equip individuals with the tools they need to bridge the gap between financial knowledge and decision-making, but that personalized additions can allow these programs to meaningfully impact both financial literacy and behaviors. Based on the results, the implementing NGO decided to continue using one-on-one counseling as part of their financial education. Similarly, in Dalton 2021, an evaluation of urban retailers in Indonesia showed that when distributing a booklet on best practices, they found that the strongest results on profit and sales took place when it was complemented with behavioral nudges, such as a movie that showed the success of exemplary peers, and two 30-minute personalized visits from local educators. Next slide, please. What about the impact on migrants? In Qatar, researchers invited Indian migrant workers to a savings-focused financial literacy workshop on financial decisions for themselves and their wives back home in India. This one-time workshop, despite having a 41% attendance, did increase joint financial decision-making among workers and their wives. In addition, for workers with low savings, it also increased their savings by nearly 35%. In Indonesia, 400 female Indonesian overseas migrant workers received additional training provided by recruiting agencies. This included components such as financial planning, and the training emphasized things that were specific to the migrant workers, such as sending and receiving remittances and understanding migrant insurance. Researchers tested the relative efficacy of delivering training only to migrant workers, only to the main remittance receiver, or to both. While knowledge increased when either the worker or the remittance receiver were trained, the greatest impact occurred when both were trained together. On average, their savings were twice as large as the comparison households. Researchers believe that the success of this financial education program versus others may be attributable to the fact that the specific program was targeted to those who could use it most. It was actionable since the women were about to immigrate and earn money, and it was accessible in that it was the most useful when delivered to both parties who would be involved in the financial decisions going forward. Next slide, please. So what about opening accounts? Another study in Indonesia selected unbanked households from 112 villages to receive a financial incentive ranging from $3 to $14 in exchange for opening a bank account. In addition, half of the sample were then randomly chosen to attend a 2-hour financial education program on opening bank accounts and bank accounts in general. Next slide, please. They found that 69% of those who were invited to the program attended the training, but the training was not effective as means to promote bank account usage. On average, the training had no effect on opening bank accounts, while even small amounts of the subsidy led to significant increases in bank account openings. For households with no schooling, training increased the probability of opening accounts also by nearly 13%. A follow-up study 2 years after the initial accounts were offered found that incentives had what they called a sticky effect, meaning that households that were originally offered high subsidies were more likely to have used bank accounts in the past year to deposit, withdraw, send, or receive funds. Next slide, please. Women in high and low income countries are less likely than men to succeed as entrepreneurs. Previous evidence suggests gender gap in performance is not due to simple deficits in business know-how. In many countries, women face social constraints that limit their mobility and interpersonal interactions. This study examines the effects of business training program in addition to different levels of peer support on women in the informal sector within India. Next slide, Michael. And it found that 70% attended this 2-day training session on financial literacy, business skills, and aspirations for bank customers. The researchers found no impact on the probability to save, but women who received the training with a friend were 9 percentage points more likely, which is actually nearly 150% increase, to take up a loan within 4 months of completing the training. Additionally, it raised borrowing and income among a subgroup of women who face strict social constraints. These results suggest that inadequate peer support among entrepreneurial women may limit financial inclusion efforts, and that programs designed to empower restricted women through business trainings may be more successful if they harness peer support as part of their program design. Next slide, please. In addition to thinking about how to design financial education courses, we have to consider who to deliver these trainings to. There is evidence from several studies that financial trainings can have differential effects, and that uneducated or marginalized populations may be more positively impacted than others. Let's examine a few of the previous studies that we just noted. In Colombia, the impacts were larger for populations who were poorer, less educated, younger, and in more rural areas, suggesting that the information provided by Lista was particularly important for households facing relatively greater financial challenges. In India, the 2-day intervention for female entrepreneurs on financial literacy, business skills, and aspirations showed no impact on the probability of saving, but when complemented with, when delivered with a peer in the group also, it did increase their likelihood of taking up a loan within 4 months of completing the program. In Indonesia, rural unbanked households received a 2-hour financial education program as part of a bank account offering. And it showed that for households with no schooling, training increased the probability of opening an account by a much larger amount. Finally, in Qatar, an intervention of a savings-focused 1-day financial literacy workshop for Indian migrant workers focused on financial decisions for themselves and their lives in India showed that overall increased their joint decision-making, but there was no change in workers' financial practices. But for the workers with initially low savings, it did increase their savings amount by 35%. Next slide. Thinking a bit longer term, a recent study by Horn 2021, the researchers worked with youth clubs in Uganda to examine if financial knowledge change is necessary for savings behavior change and outcome improvements. To tell the differential impacts of the clubs were assigned to an education only, an accounts only, both, or neither. And they found that after 1 year, the education interventions produced large increases in financial knowledge and trust in banks. The account only only shifts neither financial knowledge, planning, agency, or trust. And then in a 5-year follow-up, it found that the education impacts on savings and earnings have dissipated, though they still remained higher. The authors suggest that recipients have learned the underlying principles as seen by the behavior change without maybe demonstrating that textbook knowledge as measured by traditional tests of financial literacy. And so next slide. And so the policy lesson from these examples that I've shared is there is no universal approach to improving financial behaviors, but research indicates that customizing programs to suit specific groups may lead to lasting results. Moreover, directing these tailored interventions towards marginalized populations has the potential for even greater impacts. The key is to design interventions that are simple, targeted, actionable, accessible, and offering valuable guidance on how to effectively engage with these groups. And next slide. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. And at this point, I think maybe I'll invite Edison back, but I think we will take a couple questions here.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much, Tyler. You and Michael were very with those very important topics for us. Now, Luis, you have the floor, so you can share with us your thoughts and your comments and the questions of the public. You all the attendees, you have the P&R Q&A box, so you can write there your questions. So, Luis, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Michael, Tyler, and Emily, for such a great presentation. I think we're on the same page here, and I would like to share with you, rather than questions, perhaps further insight from Colombia, the Colombian case. We at Universidad del Norte and at the business school, we have been conducting several studies on entrepreneurs and also migrant and informal entrepreneurs and how they manage their finances. And even though some of them have been interventions and others have been more based on surveys and qualitative methods, I think we are on the same page with you guys. And I would have to say the first thing that we found is that these programs, these financial literacy programs, have to be very much tailored and customized to the specific realities of let's say, of each population. We've found that financial exclusion still is a reality in Colombia, even though there are, the percentage of population that is using at least one financial product has increased throughout the years. Microcredit is still, access to microcredit is not that common until now. There are many requirements and conditions that need to be fulfilled. So here we in our studies, we have adopted not only a standpoint from the opportunity to act or access perspective, but mainly from the ability to act, or how do we understand better these segments to make it easier for them to use and let's say in a more responsible way microcredit. And one feature we found is that these segments, they find it very difficult in terms of money separation issues. They find it really difficult to make the difference between what is it that their businesses need in terms of financing and what do their households need. So it's kind of the same pocket, because at the end of the day, it's the same person, is the same entrepreneur that is striving to go as days go on, but in some ways they find it very difficult. So I would say that one of the main things of these interventions could be to, let's say, customize these training programs and take into account this reality. If you first know how to manage your personal finances, then as Tyler was presenting, it will be very likely that you will do better in terms of savings and then further growing and taking credit for your business. Another thing that we found as well is that these financial training programs should go beyond technical training. Right. what skills they need to know, what skills they need to manage to do well, but also what is their understanding of money? What are the values behind social values, cultural values behind the use of money? And mostly, how do their communities perceive these borrowers when they use credit? Last week, we were talking with let's say with someone that is belongs to this segment, and she was telling us that some members of their community frown on her when she uses microcredit because they can't tell where the money came from. Whereas in these neighborhoods, there are lots of payday lenders, loan sharks, private lenders, which are socially accepted in the community. So I would say also that these training programs should take into account that other reality, which is which other finance providers are out there that are making their life, let's say, easier in terms of access, convenience, and so forth, more, let's say, easier conditions to borrowers. Because we have found cases in which these private lenders basically provide jargon-free services. They speak the same language as the borrower. Also, they are just outside of the door, and it's very easily accessible. So people don't have to, let's say, use their own time to go and to an office branch and get the money. And in general terms, let's say, what is it that makes them different and more convenient to these borrowers? And also let them know in these training programs that they are more expensive. They're more expensive, and we can sometimes we get our head spinning around and think around the fact that if these businesses, informal businesses, do well and are able to pay back such expensive loans, it would be great if they could have more access and more knowledge on microcredit, on formal microcredit. So all these aspects we think are really, really important to be taken into account when designing these training programs. And perhaps I have one question that really caught my attention, and it is, right, there are specific segments like high growth entrepreneurs, those that have also used previously taken credit. Those are the most likely to be more successful compared to newcomers, let's say. But what could be done for those newcomers, for those that use credit for the first time, that have no credit record, that have no knowledge, and that might find it difficult because they actually don't know the difference between a grant, a credit, and a special favor, let's say, from a third party? That would be my question for you guys. Thanks again for your presentation.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. Those were great. So I think on this last point, it's very interesting. It raises some interesting questions because, yeah, like if you can identify the businesses that are already more substantial, then giving them credit can really just help them keep going. But then there's the question remains: we can't only create businesses by helping those that exist already. What about the new ones? And I think there are some other types of studies that can shed light on that. So there've been a lot of studies about youth unemployed in other contexts, giving them cash grants to experiment with entrepreneurship, and then those who realize that it's for them, you may be taking them and putting them on a growth path. I think offering much more targeted training, financial literacy. I think also starting with small financial products, having people show that to themselves and to lenders that they can manage that debt capacity. I think all of those are potential solutions to this question. But I do think it is quite interesting. You know, I think that the fact that the microcredit literature showed that there are a substantial number in the India study that I was involved in, it's about 30% of the businesses. It's not just the 5% superstars that have this that are pre-existing businesses that are driving these big profit results. So it's a substantial fraction, and I think since the literature has shown that there are higher returns from just taking the product that exists now and reaching them, that's been one focus. But it'll be a more difficult question of how to reach those newcomers. But I do think it's an important one.
Emily, what do you think of perhaps having a compulsory training program prior to lending the money to these newcomers?
Yeah, I think there have been a lot of things that have been tried. I think training that makes sense. I think another thing that might be even better is having people sit in that training and come up with a business plan. What will this enterprise actually look like? What, if you plan, what's the potential scale? Who's your market? I think that is a piece of it that could be very valuable. There are some evaluations underway. These are targeted again toward higher growth people, but again, young newcomers. Thinking about what an incubator and accelerator does, maybe there's a way to do that for the smaller businesses to get them past that, very subsistence level and get them more to the solid corner store community business type scale. So I think that is an interesting thing to test, definitely.
We've seen quite an evolution in terms of, let's say, some entrepreneurs that have taken training programs with us from the initial pitch. And then, let's say, 1 or 2 months later, they are completely different people when they talk, more confident, less shy, and they are just so outgoing that you say, wow, they just want to eat the world. And they just a simple training in basic management skills makes a difference and make them feel different.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just jump in here really quickly, this is actually one of the key themes in one of our initiatives, which is one of those like evidence generation research, competitive research funds that J-PAL Global is running within the Jobs and Opportunities Initiative. If you're interested in conducting research of your own that studies the impacts of business training programs that target like soft skills or other skills that like might not be captured in like the typical traditional like classroom-based training programs where they put like 30 people in a room and teach them a bunch of technical concepts that nobody's like gonna hold on to, then this is like a really interesting frontier of research for us, and we encourage you to like reach out about it and to see what opportunities there are there.
Thank you. There is another fascinating topic that I think was you, Michael, that mentioned it. It's gender related, and understanding the reality of women in our context is really important to understand why they perform better or not when it comes to work-life balance and empowerment and also those like kind of soft better performance measures that go beyond profit, revenue, or cash-based measures. And also, I wanted to mention something on the performance measures that were presented. These economies are very much informal, and as such, they are cash-based. So we found throughout our studies that sometimes they cannot make the difference between how much are you earning and how much are you taking back home. So I would say that we have made more emphasis on cash-based measures, and yeah, it gives us an idea of if at the end of the day, at the micro level, the entrepreneur is getting like something better from taking the risk of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, so the original narrative of microfinance, part of the theory of change is that microfinance traditionally targeted women. Women are, underserved. Low-income populations are underserved in general. Women are especially underserved. Women are often more interested in investing in education and in their children in some contexts. And so part of that theory of change is that the woman invests in her business, she earns more profits, she can invest that in her children, in education. It's empowering. So unfortunately, in that first wave of studies, those types of outcomes were in there, and consistent with the impacts on income and business profits not being so overwhelming for the average person, those empowerment measures also came back kind of underwhelming. And I think there was a lot of disappointment. But I think the good news is that in some of these follow-up studies where they were looking at the grace period, so the tweak where you give them 2 extra months and the profits are much, much higher, those same researchers went back to those households many, many years later, once their children were old enough to already have completed secondary school, and they did find those types of empowerment outcomes. The children were more likely to be educated, and they had built an intergenerational ladder out of self-employment actually into more formal employment along the lines of that original narrative. So I think the original narrative was there. It was there for a subset of people. And so where people have been patient enough to wait and look, when you get the product right, in terms of getting those business investments and the household income investments, the other stuff does seem to follow, and so that is a positive development in the more recent studies. I think it's pretty exciting.
Now, another skill we found that these informal entrepreneurs either have it or not is that how they can combine different sources of funds. Based on the bricolage theory. So basically their ability to, let's say, to know how to play the game in terms of how they understand money management. Well, then they use obviously funds from family and friends, microcredit institutions, I was saying earlier, payday lenders, private lenders, but some are more successful than others. And it seems to be that when they are clear on that, right, they might be mixing their personal finances, but the business finances, but at the end of the day, they need to look after their business because that's the main source of income. That's what makes them more or less successful. So Colombia is a very diverse country. So we have 5 regions, and even so, even though we share obviously common values in our culture, each region is very, very specific. So again, I think these studies are very much context-based, and I don't know. I'm thinking, is it possible at all to generalize results given these very, very specific conditions?
I think that was a big question at the beginning of these RCTs. I think what's been quite interesting in the context of microfinance is that there were these 7 studies done on pretty similar products, but in very different contexts. And the results have come back remarkably consistent across those different sites. So I think that helps in our confidence of generalizing. Now, in all of our these product tweaks, we get evidence from one country at a time. So we do need to be a little bit cautious at what will generalize and what won't. But I think one of the exciting things about the RCT methodology for social programs, I think microcredit was one of the first places it was applied. We have such a big body of evidence from so many different settings that we feel more comfortable generalizing than I think we would have 10 years ago. And so that's I think that's a great plus. I think we don't yet know how to say, let's take the results of this study and think about how we should, we learned something in India. How much do we learn about Colombia? I think that those tools are something that one could build, and we're not there yet. But the brute force of replicating these studies across many, many sites is what gives us more confidence in these results.
And I also think,
and I do think that you're right about the people having a big portfolio of credit. And I think from a policymaker perspective, at some point in time, people were really focused, are they banked or unbanked? But that's not really an appropriate assessment of somebody's access to credit. Some people have a lot of informal access to credit from their social networks, from informal money lenders. Sometimes those relationships are really valuable and they're not predatory. And so then maybe the marginal impact for a formal lender coming into that neighborhood is actually not so high, because while they're unbanked formally, they have enough credit. And so I don't think that from a policy perspective, we've thought about the interplay between the formal and the informal enough in financial inclusion and access to credit.
Yes, and also that might explain why some formal lenders are not significant in the models, and why other specific others, let's say, that offer very convenient conditions, even among informal lenders, are more helpful for entrepreneurs. And also something else we are looking at is at the stage of the entrepreneurship. If it's at the nascent or at the current stage, it does make a difference. And also kind of building up on the previous knowledge and the skills and the skills, not only technical, but also financial skills that they acquire throughout time. And that's something that of course it needs to be further studied, but longitudinal studies are required to build on this.
And I think one very exciting possibility as more and more payments are digitized and customers are paying shops in digital forms of money, one might hope that there can be more of a transition from the informal sources of finance to the larger formal sources of finance, because I think historically they've been pretty separate, and finding a way to bridge that transition I think has high returns. And so I think in the finance sector in general, we're pretty excited about all of the scope. And it sounds like you had a webinar very recently about this, about the new kinds of credit information that are available to lenders, what the increase in digital payments means for monitoring, for enforcement, for screening. I think that's all very, very exciting. And we're actively interested in sourcing new projects that kind of explore those themes. COVID was an interesting experience where it really did accelerate digital payment systems, and the environment for fintech to come in and really take advantage of that is here. And I think on the financial literacy side, that poses a whole new interesting set of financial literacy problems. How do you make sure people are digitally included? If they don't understand these analog systems and they're not digitally literate, how can you possibly make sure they're included in those systems? How do you think about the design of fast money products that's in an ethical, responsible way that doesn't just generate debt traps and payday loans, because those are going to be the most profitable kinds of products for lenders. So I think there's a whole set of really interesting questions that are now ripe for asking and studying, given the way things have moved in the last 5 years.
And then with the emergence of AI, all the data that can be collected with voicemails, text messages, the language that is being used, I think there will be a lot of opportunities to understand better these contexts, these segments, and then design training programs for those that we hope will have more access to microcredit.
Very good point.
Edinson, I don't know if there are any questions from the audience.
No, it seems that there's no questions. So, and I think you two, Emily and Luis, have done a very good chat between you two. So I just would like to thank you, all of you, Emily, Michael, and Tyler. Luis, of course, you're always welcome, part of the house. And thank all the attendees, all the people that gathers together to speak about this important issue today. From the financial literacy program of the AMV, we want to, we are sure that this is just the first step between J-PAL, Universidad del Norte. We are at AMV to keep going with these topics in further occasion. So thank you very much, guys, Emily, Michael, Tyler, and Luis, for being with us here at the AMV, and I hope we can see us back in other seminars. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Looking forward to keeping the conversation going.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.